Well, Numbers 25, we're going to focus on mostly this morning and leave 26 till another day with the following chapters. And it's another extraordinary episode in the history of Israel with crazy things happening. It's great to know from the last couple of chapters, as we've seen, that God will bless his people. That cannot be undone. Whatever others try to do to curse them, his people will be blessed. But Numbers 25 now makes the point that the problem is not ultimately out there in the world. The real problem is in here, in the heart. And what we find is that though Balaam was unable to curse the people of God, because whatever he tried to say, out of his mouth came blessings, he found another way instead. If you flick forwards to chapter 31 and verse 16, there's some judgment going on there, and it's pointed out that some women are going to be there's a question about whether these women are going to live, because verse 16, they were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and were the means of turning the Israelites away from the Lord in what happened at Peor, so that a plague struck the Lord's people. Now that is what we're talking about here in chapter 25. Verse 1, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women who invited them to the sacrifices to their gods. The people ate and bowed down before these gods. So this sexual immorality and this idol worship, and this is the first mention of Baal in the Bible, this is all provoked by Balaam. So he's found another way in. That isn't just cursing the people of God. He has found a way to appeal to their hearts, to get them themselves to turn away from God. So immediately, the big thing we're seeing here is the problem for Israel is not just out there in the world with their enemies doing bad things to them. The problem is right here in their hearts and their ability to turn away from sin. And so even as these great things are happening and God is doing this extraordinary thing with putting words in the mouth of Balaam, meanwhile, it's a bit like on Mount Sinai. So up there on the mountain, great things going on between Moses and God. Down there at the bottom of the mountain, golden calf worship going on with the people of Israel. And it's exactly the same here. So just as we thought, fantastic, we've seen how wonderful God is and what he's doing for his people. Camera shifts to where what are God's people doing? They're turning away in idol worship. So judgment is going to come. It's slightly ambiguous. Remember how important it is that the people that Moses should listen to what God says. We've seen that already, and it's slightly ambiguous as to whether he really does that. Verses 4 and 5. But before we can really get to grips with that, adding insult to injury is verse 6, which is just a sort of classic moments. There's weeping going on. Everyone's weeping about their sin. They're standing at the entrance to the tents and they're realizing how wrong it's been to indulge in this. And then out of the blue, this Israelite man comes along with his Midianite foreign wife, the very thing that they've been told not to do. And you can imagine the scene. He sort of turns up with her to Israel gathered at their tents, and they're sort of looking at each other. Him and this woman looking at each other, thinking, is this a bad time? What's going on? And off they go into their tent. And it's not Moses now, it's Phinehas, who takes a spear in his hand and follows the Israelite into the tent. And we presume in the act of copulation, takes the spear and drives it through both of them. It's a pretty extraordinary thing to be described. Now we kind of think, this is horrendous in 21st century. How can you read about this? It's striking that the thing that shocks us in the 21st century is the judgment of God and not the sin itself. And I think earlier readers of the Bible would note that about us in the 21st century, that we are more shocked by God's judgment than by the sin that ought to provoke it. But the point with the sin is not just, it's about sex. The point is it's about idolatry. It's about thinking, I don't need to worship the Lord my God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength. I don't need to live for him alone. I can engage in the practices of the other nations, and in particular, marrying and engaging in sexual relations with other nations. The problem with that was it was going to draw their hearts away from worshipping the one true God. And so it's always a very, very serious thing for God's people to be drawn astray in this way. And so Phinehas, though, takes the spear. He does this, and the Lord says, verse 11, he has turned my anger away from the Israelites, for he was as zealous as I am for my honour among them, so that in my zeal I did not put an end to them. Therefore tell him, I am making my covenant of peace with him. He and his descendants will have a covenant of a lasting priesthood, because he was zealous for the honour of his gods and made atonement for the Israelites. So we've shifted away from Moses, and this is the end of that generation, the Moses generation. Moses himself will not enter the land. The people who live in that generation will not enter the land. And then we come in the following chapters to the second census and a new generation in the next 40 years before they then enter the promised land. So it's no longer about Moses. There's a new covenant with Phinehas. He is the priest whose priestly work, whose priestly act of righteousness has turned away God's wrath, so that because these two people have died, the wrath does not fall on all those, or it ends the plague. The plague ends with 24,000, but the plague stops with the act of righteousness. So what does this say to the people of God today? It says two things. It says that the problem is not out there, but in here. So don't think that the worst problem that we face is coronavirus. Don't think that the worst problem we face is the economy. Realise that the worst problem we face is right here in our hearts. And the question for the people of God is, are we going to give in to temptation and sin in these times and go our own way and think, I don't need to follow God now. Things have got too bad. I'm just going to go my own way. Forget meeting with his people. Forget following him. Forget telling others about Jesus. Forget following Jesus seriously in these days. Now, that would be exactly what the devil wants us to do in the spirit of Balaam, leading God's people astray. We might think that our worst problem is coronavirus. No, our worst problem is our sinful hearts, and it remains that, just as it is always. So keep coming to God, keep confessing sin, keep taking it seriously, but also know that there is one who has fulfilled what Phinehas did here with an act of righteousness, which then means that God's people do not receive the judgment that we deserve, because Jesus has taken it for us. God's wrath has been turned aside through the righteous act of our great high priest. So put our trust in him in the face of our sin, and keep going and keep trusting him.